Okay. We're ready for our next panel. The next panel is Any Room... No, that's not the right one. Psyched Up. I could tell because everyone is so psyched up. Okay. Thank you, everyone. I'm just going to pass it over to the moderator, Derek Pasborg. Take it from here.
Welcome to our second panel of the day titled Psyched Up. My name's Derek, and I'll be your moderator for the session. Before we get underway, I would first like to welcome our panelists, Dr. Nick Bowman from Syracuse University, Eleonora Diletta Sarcinella, who will be joining us online with her colleagues from Catholic University of the Sacred Heart, and Dr. Buddhika Bellana and Dr. Raymond A. Marr from York University. So each panelist will be given, you'll be given 15 minutes. We'll give you a 5-minute warning, 1-minute warning, and we'll be ready to move on from that. Maybe we'll have some questions, time for questions at the end. Otherwise, take it away, Dr. Nick.
All right. Hey, thank you so much for having us here. Am I okay? Yeah, there we go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sense of place. Let me see if I can get my slides run up here. This is the view from my balcony in Taipei. So once a week, you're having dinner, your trash and recycling have been piling up because they're very strict on where and how you drop off your goods. Not being from the area, this was a bit of a weird haunting experience where I would just hear at 9 o'clock at night, people scurrying in the streets with their baggage, with their garbage, running past these trucks. What it came to be was how I met my neighbors, as that one guy who's probably not from Taipei, living in this apartment complex. This is where the neighborhood got together once a week. And about 8:30, I go downstairs, bump into my neighbors. You could tell that's where like kids were playing. People would talk about business, talk about the weather, talk about their experiences. Because if you haven't been to Taiwan, in the wake of a lot of environmental disaster, there's been a renewed interest on really keeping the city clean. So you go to the truck, you've separated out your disposables, your compostables, your trash, your recycling. This truck is like 9 different units and boxes. But it becomes a ritual. And it was the most mundane thing. And it's when I felt like I lived there. It's like when I finally had this experience where this wasn't tourism anymore. This wasn't passing through anymore. This was me grabbing my garbage like everybody else and just trying to practice my Mandarin with my neighbors. And they would kind of giggle because I know about 300 characters. You know, and in that video, if it were still playing, right behind the truck was like the grocery store where I got my apple and like learned how to get change and things like this. This didn't seem like it was going to matter outside of living there, but I was living there in January of 2020. So I got sent home a couple months later. And so this video, this song, it's, oh gosh, A Maiden's Tale. Every time I hear it, I think about living in Taipei, living in this tiny little piece of the city and participating in this incredibly basic experience that actually became one of the most important parts of my time there. It's also what made me feel like I was missing the city entirely, right? And so what I'm going to talk about today is sort of how we go through sense of place, how we connect to places. Because if we understand how we connect to places, we can really start to understand what it means to lose a place. So I don't know if you've heard of sense of place. It comes from cultural geography. It's this idea that not all spaces are places, but there are those places that are things that we know intimately. We form relationships with them. We know the place like we know a person, right? Even today, when I go back to Taipei and I walk down the street and I hear the trash truck song at night, I still have memories of like, oh yeah, that's the thing where you grab the thing and chase after the truck and all of this. It's where my neighbors hung out, right? It's this idiosyncratic emerging through emotional ties. It's when you start connecting to, it's no longer the name of the street, the name of the building, the name of the song, right? It's the smells, it's the sights, it's the people. It's all of the things that when you're removed from the place, those connections don't go away, which is what makes the place hard to miss. Because the place holds them, and you've lost access to it, and kind of all that's left are these memories. And they're these emotional memories that kind of linger and stay with you. To know a place fully is to understand it in the way you know a person. So lots of you might be from Montreal, But I suspect that you can describe a very different experience in the same city with the same neighbors, and yet your sense and your sense are very, very different for all the reasons we've come to understand over time, right? So when we study sense of place, it's this function of the settings. If you think about the place as a diorama, the place as the background, the drama, the stage, right? We all attach different meanings to those things that we're doing in those locations, to the activities in those places, right? And then there's this sense of character that kind of emerges from how we engage the space. I always tell the story of my first time in Montreal was in, I think, 2008 or so, and I had a horrendous time. I was a grad student from the States, and I was still very loud and very kind of annoying. And I show up in Montreal in my mid-20s, and I'm like, let's get some beers and watch hockey. And they're like, get out. We would prefer it if you would leave, right? This establishment and that establishment. And I talked about coming back last year, and it was my first time back. I'm a little older. I'm here on a different business. I go to bed at 9:30 now. I'm a little quieter. And it was a much friendlier place. Oh, hey, come on in. Would you like to try a local beer? You seem like a nice fellow. What are you doing in the States? Right? And I remember, like, it took a couple of days for, like, my bygone conclusions about the city as being highly exclusionary and, like, they don't want us here to shifting it very quickly, right? The sense of character was different. I also was probably looking in different places. This side of St. Catharines and not that side of St. Catharines, right? All the backdrops, by the way, in these slides are places I remember, right? So this would have been more of Taipei. Here, Cicero's bar in St. Louis, Missouri, where I basically grew up. Literally, I think at that stool, like right there. Sense of place has always been studied offline. It's always been studied in the physical. It comes from people trying to explain that geography is more than labels and resources, that we do actually connect to the spaces around us, hometowns, right? And Jamie and I recently started asking the question, like, what about online spaces? They're not just novelties. I mean, by 2025, we have been fluidly moving between on and offline spaces for a good couple of decades now. Anybody play Warcraft in here? I mean, this has been around for a long time. You may have a second hometown, right? Orgrimmar, obviously, right? What do we do online? Same thing we do offline. This is Jamie and I on a date at Dark Moon Fair, because she lived in Toronto and I lived in West Virginia, and that's a real long drive. But once a month, you can go to the carnival, and we would go to the carnival. And I would put away my sword and get out a fishing rod, and we'd walk around the carnival, do carnival things, VOIP, and then have a good time, right? I don't even play Warcraft anymore, but I still see Dark Moon Fair much in the same way I see my hometown carnival when I was 9, because it has that, it was functionally and the same thing. It's just not ephemeral, right? So quickly, what isn't sense of place? It's not knowing names or facts. Lots of us can name off roads, buildings, and that such, but that's not sense of place. And not every place you go, you form a sense of place with. There are plenty of places I've been that you just don't make the connection. You're there for work, it's transactional, you leave, and it is what it is, right? It's not presence. So in psychology, that idea of the illusion of non-mediation in a mediated space, that's not sense of place. That's just you feel like you're sitting in a chair. You feel like you're in a room. Those aren't the same things. It's probably the case that if you feel present in a digital world, it will eventually elicit sense of place. But it's very important to point out that presence is in situ while you're logged in. Sense of place is you thinking about it later, you making that connection, right? It's not immersion. Immersion is defined many ways, but it often deals with a psychological involvement or a sensory involvement. Again, we're really talking about meaning making. We're really talking about relational understandings of place. And again, it's why do some places matter and some don't? And that's what sense of place is. We occupy lots of places in our lives, but only a couple of them we sort of elevate. And actually, one way we say it is we occupy spaces in our lives, but there's only a couple that become places. That weird balcony on the 9th floor when the trash truck starts playing is a place of mine. It's actually on my arm, actually, like the mountain chain. You can't see the trash truck there, but you can see the building at least. I should put the truck on for my next round of ink. As we live in increasingly hybrid worlds, this idea that we move very seamlessly is doing a lot of lifting, but we move very quickly between the online and the offline. You know, some of us don't even like talking about logging on and logging off anymore. It's really just my phone's over there right now, but there's still parts of me that are very much in that space, right? Which one matters more? So on the top was the first apartment I rented in St. Louis. Looks really nice. It's not very nice. That's a wonderfully cropped photo, right? What's on the bottom? You recognize that? Zelda. That game takes about 300 hours to complete. At some point, you're spending enough time in these digital worlds seamlessly. I don't know if it matters. I don't know if it matters that much which one's which. And I hinted at this a little bit when I was here last year. And we're going to go into much more detail here. And in the background, by the way, is the city of St. Louis, for what it is, you know, my hometown. It's gotten to the point where I don't know if you have one hometown, if you have one place. Some of my experiences in these digital places are every bit as formative. If you go back into the 80s and 90s and study some of the bulletin board communities, especially for people who could not find peers and shared interests, or if you're in a marginalized group, that bulletin board community, that was a place that really mattered and kept you going for quite a long time, right? These things have spires. Jamie and I have discovered these sort of elements of place that matter. Symbols. Some places stand for something. Taipei 101 was meant to be a statement about the city and its emergence. Purpose. Some places host things that we do, right? Whether it's a temple or a religious building, maybe it's a home or a bedroom, but it has a function. Identity. You know, certain places we sort of one-to-one see as part of us. So if you've ever been to New York City, you will see NY hats, even by folks who don't watch baseball, because that logo just means the city. You know, for me, it's STL, it's the arch, it's a part of your identity. When you see that symbol, you know you're home. As cheesy as it sounds when I fly back from traveling into New York, Statue of Liberty actually kind of matters. It's complicated now, but there's still that feeling, like after being overseas for a couple of weeks and you're flying into Newark and you see the statue and you're like, yeah, okay, I'm home. Now I got to unpack a lot of other stuff, but I'm home. Unpack literally and figuratively, right? Relations, it's the stuff that allows us to connect. That is generic. You're like, great, it's a Google map. Those are the tennis courts at Michigan State University. And every Saturday morning at 6 a.m. during football season, about 50 of us woke up, got in our trucks, loaded up our grills, drove to the tennis court, and cooked breakfast, and stood out in the cold until noon to scream at a bunch of kids playing football. And there, by a couple of us, I mean about 250,000 people would gather here. They would just spray the grass with this acrylic fake green shell to protect the lawn. And basically the police are like, look, just don't throw anything. If you could just not throw anything. But the tennis courts became really important for like all of our connections for years when we were going to college, right? So like that image to me already, I'm getting all this vibe. Emotions, stimulating this affective vector, that something that happened there mattered to me. This is Shrimp Brothers shrimp fishing in Taipei, where you go urban shrimp fishing. And a friend of mine from Taipei showed me his childhood, which involved all these incredibly mundane experiences. This is a concrete shrimp bath behind a car wash outside of Taipei. And it became this incredibly exciting place as we competed over shrimp, right? To get to the point of loss, as I get to the end of the presentation, I'm going to kind of, what we see in loss is that many of these spires play an outsized role in loss. Purpose is a big one. We absolutely remember the places that we can no longer access when they gave us something, right? the first home run, that first experience over here. This is really difficult in gaming because we've always assumed you just go back to a game, and that's not true. I mean, we've seen 89+% of games can't be played anymore, or when they're changed or corrupted in some way that you can't get back to the experience. But it hosted a particular thing to do, a particular life event. So nostalgia being more than just the past, it's our autobiographical past. Well, those places that gave us a purpose, that served an event as the stage of the event, those matter. Relations. Whenever you talk to folks about nostalgia, you'll notice that even if you didn't ask, they will immediately tell you about their connections, right? And of course, the emotions. These three pop up. Symbols and identity don't really pop up very much at all when we talk about lost places and lost connections. And same role here. So as we go throughout the day, I'd love to talk more about this. The general takeaway is this understanding that sense of place is something we've always attached to the ephemeral, but we're increasingly attaching it to the digital. And it plays an important role of how we define ourselves. And again, just to reinforce those two notes, purpose, relations, and emotions. And I'm happy to kind of unpack those throughout the day. And if you think of any, put them on the roses. So thanks for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Nick. That was a great presentation. Our next panelist is going to be Eleonora, who's joining us virtually.
Hello.
Hello,
everyone.
The floor is yours, Eleonora.
Okay, thank you so much. Just a minute. Okay. There are my slides. You can see them.
Yes. Yep.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. I'm Eleonora Diletta Sarcinella. I'm a PhD student to Catholic University of Milan, and my PhD project focuses on nostalgia in psychological research. It's my pleasure to be here and present our preliminary results about analysis of keywords in the scientific field of nostalgia. So before we begin, let's look at what nostalgia is. We know that nostalgia combines two Greek words, nostos and algos, and literally nostalgia means painful yearning to return home. The literature defined nostalgia as a positive emotion with lost tones. This complex emotion is often triggered by loneliness, when people remember an important moment of their life, such as the graduation day, wedding, or maybe birth. Nostalgia can serve a dual purpose. It can serve an improvement function, since individuals with high nostalgic proneness can experience increased psychological well-being, and regulatory function. For example, when people feel loneliness, they might reconnect with nostalgic memories for comfort. Here we can see the nostalgia as a life continuum, because we can see nostalgia that is characterized by high-level cognitive appraisal and propositional content. Nostalgia is a happiness-related emotion, but at the same time, it can evoke sadness because some aspects of the past are out of reach. Here we can find, for example, a past love. Also, nostalgia can be foreseen and expected in the form of anticipated nostalgia. This form of nostalgia is defined as the anticipation of feeling nostalgic for life experiences when looking back on them. Both types of nostalgia comprise a combination of positive and negative emotions, with the positive emotions surpassing the negative ones. A related concept is anticipatory nostalgia, defined as missing what has not yet been lost. The key difference between these two types of nostalgia, future-oriented, is when the emotion is experienced. We can also see nostalgia as change-related emotion. When individuals feel discomfort for the present. For example, in the life change moment, which can be natural of transition, as we can see in our picture, or externally through threats such as war, nostalgia acts as a psychological defense mechanism, helping individuals to cope with difficult times. For example, nostalgia can improve social connectedness and help the individual manage negative psychological states. For this reason, in an interesting study in Germany, fear of isolation influenced nostalgic media consumption during the first block of COVID-19. In these events, nostalgia can inspire a sense of purpose and clarity, guiding people towards meaningful feelings and goals, and promoting optimism and happiness. So our study is on symptomatic analysis. We use this analysis to connection different disciplines and fields and papers. Symptometric is defined as the quantitative study of science. With this analysis, we can map scientific papers in the area of nostalgia, considering for example, here, keywords as only parameters. Our research question was, what are the keywords or the topic associated with the study of nostalgia in the scientific literature into the last 25 years? The aim of the study was to investigate the topics associated with nostalgia and assess if nostalgia is associated with life transformation or threats. Here we can see our methodology. The first step was to figure out which search string was right for our purpose. After this, we searched the papers on the Web Science database, so we applied the filters. In categories here, we mean that we filtered the documents for nostalgia-related content. In this presentation, we will give an overview of keywords frequency analysis. Future study will investigate the co-citation network and cluster analysis. For this, we have segmented these last 25 years into 5 years. This to better capture the phenomenon within the scientific literature and in relation to global changes. Here we can see our first result. So this is a tree map, and we can see how many times these words have been found in the keywords of papers related to nostalgia. We can see method of induction, such as music or film or here social media, the context such as tourism, or changes such as migration or climate change. In this new chart, we can see the trend topic. This helps us visually understand the evolution of keywords associated with nostalgia over these 25 years. We can see, for example, globalization has been present more frequently since 2012, with a higher focus in 2014, represented by this dot. Here, another example, we can see eco-anxiety, and there is a higher frequency only in 2023. In this another result, we can see the first 10 keywords associated to nostalgia in these papers, and how many times the word was included in the keywords, and which year it was included most time. This could be very interesting for us see the word of emotion, because emotion had the higher frequency in 2020, sorry. So here, in our study, the result provide a general overview of nostalgia in the existing scientific field of research, focusing on the relationships with other topics and the temporal evolution of nostalgia. These preliminary results will be also explored through a cluster and network analysis based on the paper's keywords. Here we can find the links between one topic and the other one in the scientific field. To conclusion, we can see nostalgia as change-directed emotion, but also our research, our question of research is also how can we investigate nostalgia in relation to change or transformation? And our proposal studies are 3 for now. The first one is about transformative experience, for example, travel transformative. The study nostalgia in creative context, and finally using the virtual reality such as liminal space for inducing nostalgia in the participant, for example in the lab context. So this is our review. Thank you so much, and thanks to my research team. Okay, I didn't see you, but I'm here. Okay, I can see you now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Eleonora. That was a fantastic presentation. So to conclude this panel, I pass it off to Dr. Bowman, Dr. Bellana, and Dr. Marr.
Excellent, thank you. So we're going to talk about deep emotional engagement with stories at various timescales. While we're engaging with a specific story, like for example, Breath of the Wild, we have these deep cognitive emotional engagements with what's happening within the narrative. But these deep emotions, feelings, and thoughts don't end there, you know? So moments after we complete playing, you know, these thoughts and feelings still linger with us, maybe for minutes, hours. And then of course, even at the longer time scale, years and years later, they can reemerge and reappear. And I would say that within psychology, we know the most about, you know, our emotional engagement while we're directly consuming or comprehending the story. We know a little bit about these lingering feelings, minutes and moments and hours afterwards, and we know very little about the nostalgic experiences that they emerge years later, and we know probably nothing about how these 3 different timescales interact with one another. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about our direct engagement with stories. I'll pass it to Buddhika to talk about lingering, and then to Nick to talk about nostalgia. So we are obviously surrounded by stories of all kinds, such as novels, television shows based on novels, movies based on novels, video games that are now TV shows, graphic novels, which will probably soon be a TV show, and as well theaters and plays that are now movies. And so we spend a lot of our free time, our leisure time, engaging with stories, because these stories are so, you know, attractive and immersive, and we know quite a bit about what this immersion looks like. You know, we can refer to it as something like narrative engagement or narrative immersion. It's also referred to as what Richard Garrick called transportation, this feeling that we're going to be transported into a narrative world have experiences within this narrative world, and then return to the real world somewhat changed by those experiences, just the same way that we're changed by our experiences travel in other worlds. You know, and this feeling of immersion and engagement in transportation has many, many different components. You know, one is just comprehension. We have to understand what's going on in the story. Of course, this involves deep and focused attention to what's happening, right? We have emotional experiences in reaction to the events of the story. We feel as if we are there, present within that story world, right? And for stories that are based entirely upon text, we also engage in visual imagery, right? So creating the sensations and images and that are being presented or represented within the text. As well, you know, these story worlds are full of characters, and we identify with those characters, see that story world from the perspective of these characters. And so we know that all these various components of narrative transportation are key for this feeling of immersion. And we've also discovered that the more transported or immersed we are in the story worlds, the more that it can change the way that we feel, think, believe, and behave, right? So our deep immersion within stories can shape our beliefs about the real world. They might even be moderating the capacity for stories to help us develop empathy. Now, I mentioned that, you know, we don't know so much about lingering and how these feelings linger, but there is a nod to it in that, you know, one of the most commonly employed scales or measures for narrative transportation includes this item, that after finishing the narrative, I found it easy to put it out of my mind. And this is a reverse score, right? So if you can easily forget about something, then it's, you know, it's not likely that we were deeply immersed in it. Right? And so we're thinking that this deep immersion, of course, is going to be related to the lingering that occurs and eventually to the nostalgia.
Cool, thank you. All right, so with that, we're going to talk a little bit about going beyond that self-report question and trying to find ways to actually measure stories persisting in our minds at the scale of minutes. And first, I just want to nod to the fact that this phenomenon that stories and immersion in stories doesn't end just during the actual moments where you're engaging with them. Retrospective imaginative involvement is a term. Star Wars, The Office, thinking about these stories and worlds and characters continues well after you have finished engaging with an episode. And World of Warcraft, the notion of game element transfer. So from playing a game, you might find that features of that gameplay experience carry over to your life outside of the game. And this kind of persistence is a characteristic notion of how video games can work. And, you know, your e-cards, the source of all psychological evidence, book hangovers, are also a really useful, I think, term that readers refer to this inability to start a new book because you're still living in the last book's world. This all just, I think, I would like to just point to as, you know, really emphasizing this persistence with which we engage with narratives. This is not necessarily nostalgia at the range of like years, but you can kind of see that this persistence, at least at the level of minutes, hours, days, seems to be something that reliably happens when we engage with stories. So what I tried to do in some recent work was come up with a way that we could actually quantify this kind of persistence at the scale of minutes at a level that was like slightly different from self-report, that I was hoping that could kind of complement some of the intuitions that kind of were inherent in the notions of narrative transportation in general. And what we're gonna talk about for the next few minutes is just, I'm gonna try to explain a little bit of the general paradigm that I've used to try to capture this notion that stories can persist in our thoughts. And that's like, you know, a hard thing to measure because I can't really grab someone's thoughts. So the question becomes, how can I come up with like even a shitty assay of this? And that's kind of what I'm gonna show you, a shitty but hopefully useful one. So what we did was we did an online experiment. The paper's here if you're ever interested in any of the particulars. But we had people read a short story online, and it was self-paced, one sentence at a time. We did it with a few stories, but one of the first ones we did was this story called So Much Water, So Close to Home by Raymond Carver. It's essentially a, I would say, 15-minute read, about 3,000 words, and it is about a murder, a husband and a wife. Essentially, the husband goes on a camping trip, comes back, tells his wife he had found a dead body, but seemed really lackadaisical about it, and his wife seems to suspect that maybe he had more of an active role in this finding of a dead body than one might. And so people read these, our participants read this short story, one sentence at a time, and we were interested in the idea that that story might persist in people's thoughts. How do you do that? We wanted to kind of come up with an assay of people's thoughts. And what we did was we had participants perform a free association task. And what free association means is essentially, quite literally, we asked them to type whatever words came to mind as they came to mind for 5 minutes, before and after reading the story, which is a strange task, as you can imagine. You first start generating words, but you might start describing things that are just around you. But the main thing that you notice if you look at free association data is that the words that people generate are not random. It's quite difficult to generate a series of random, unrelated words. When you're prompted to come up with words, the things that you come up with are like what's accessible and available to you in your mind. And if our minds have like some kind of general tendency to have only some things accessible to us in a moment, then maybe getting people to generate words would give us an assay of like a spotlight of where in their mind are they right now. Does that seem all right? So that's kind of what we did. We had that intuition with the idea that maybe after reading a story, there would be some kind of coloring, say, of their thoughts for the free association afterwards that would be different from the free association before. And maybe this could complement some of the self-reported experiences that come in the transportation scale. And so how did we actually quantify any of these data? What we used were word embeddings. Just with a raising hands, how many people have heard or are familiar with what word embeddings are? Okay, so not too many. So word embeddings are essentially the attempts from people in machine learning and natural language processing to teach machines to understand, create, reproduce language, human language. And essentially, what a word embedding is, quite concretely, is a series of numbers, so like, just say like 300 numbers, that represents the meaning of a word in a 300-dimensional space. So you can kind of think about this as if you were to take a dictionary that has all the meanings of all the words and like somehow transform that into a map, where now instead of having definitions, each word lives in a point in space. And words that are closer to one another as points in space share meaning. So if you were to, so essentially how word embeddings are generated, you essentially train an algorithm to scrape some large amount of text from the internet, for example, the entirety of Wikipedia, see which words tend to co-occur with other words. The word cat might co-occur often in the same sentence, passage, context as the word cats, or maybe feline, maybe mammal, milk, and less likely with the word, abacus, or, dark matter. And so just by virtue of looking how terms co-occur with one another in how people use language, you can get inferences about what a word means. So technically what you see here is a two-dimensional version of someone's stream of thought. You can see the words that they're generating in free association, and technically what you can see is kind of like how they move through their thoughts. And what you could do if you were to have these data is then pick points that are related to the story and measure how close are they to any of these story-related themes as they generate free associations, with the idea that they would be closer after reading as compared to before. And I won't go into the particulars, but we found a lot of different things. We found people reporting, self-reporting, that they've really felt like the story lingered in their mind after reading it, really predicted by transportation, actually, the idea that the metric that Raymond mentioned. We found that if you read a coherent story, like written in the order in which it was actually written by the author, it would linger more than if you read a sentence scrambled version or a word scrambled version of the same story. But the thing that really mattered the most was even if you read a scrambled one, but you thought that it was really immersive, that would be the most prominent determinant of whether it would persist in people's thoughts. We found that you could change it, move it up and down by instruction. If I asked someone to proofread the story for spelling errors, they wouldn't find any lingering, but if they asked them to read it for meaning, you would. And we found that people reported that it was unintentional and hard to block. But yeah, that's over the course of minutes, and how does it relate to longer timescales?
No worries. So you see where we're going with this. We're trying to stitch together this in situ psychological effect that we have a lot of experience with. How do folks respond to a story immediately? But we know in research that we chew on stories for longer, right? And we also know that not every story sticks with us. So this is a lot of things that have happened to me. And you're gonna guess in a moment that the ones that are highlighted in the sepia tones I'm gonna keep. And the ones that are in the black and white tones I don't care about for various reasons. And what makes these four pop? Well, these are some of the things we found in the literature and in our own data that make a story stick, that tend to encourage nostalgia. Self-relevance, the actions, the synchronizations, emotions. The ones I'm gonna focus on that kind of tease into the earlier presentation are things that are self-relevant, things that are sensory, and things that are social. And so this data, I haven't talked much about it, but we've extracted from a couple of hundred people's qualitative recollections of these places. Well, what lingers, I think what we're talking about here, that's the stuff that's smoldering, and we're not really paying attention to it until something happens later on that time scale that fans that fire back. And so I think what may be going on is that there's this, I don't know if I call it chronic lingering, I don't have a word for it yet, but there's just enough smoldering that it doesn't ever, I think, disappear. It just kind of fades into the back, but it stays there, right? So what's missing in this research is an understanding of sort of how long those embers burn for, how much they're there, and really, I don't think we know the time scale, because when we're studying nostalgia, we're already in the future looking backwards, but we haven't always figured out the incremental steps that get us there. That's where the three of us are trying to go, right? So if I go back here again, who's played Red Dead 2? I'm just curious. And if you've been in the Red Dead universe, you found out where the hat came from. Like John Marston gets his hat. And the entire Red Dead universe over how many years and hundreds of hours suddenly makes sense. And this like 15, this clip at the end of the game, after your horse has died, by the way, don't use your good horse at the end of this game, because you'll lose. My dad and I, on a rainy day, sat and watched all the Planet of the Apes films in order. And it was Earth all along, spoiler, right? Just playing football all throughout my life to get out of the house. First car, American, right? Ford Escort. Got to get out of the house for the first time and go do something else. These memories have some self-relevance to me. I have some freedom. I think I have some athleticism. I probably didn't. The social aspects of friends and family and my neighbors and my media characters. I suspect, even when I look at these slides now, if you gave me another hour, I could continue to go on. I won't, I promise, and tell these stories, because those things have burned in the past, right? So where we're going with all this, as we get to the very end, we have a couple of research opportunities here, and I'm just gonna put them on screen. These could also be really good encouragements for the rose petals, and we are not going anywhere today, right? We're trying to figure out these time scales. We're trying to figure out what it matters, and other than that, these are some of the questions we're trying to answer. So stay in touch with the three of us, okay? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for all your presentations, Dr. Bowman, Eleonora, Dr. Bellana, and Dr. Marr. What a fantastic panel. So we do have a few minutes for questions, 5 minutes. So if we want, do we have any questions online?
If anyone has a question, you can feel free to use the chat function in the Zoom, and we'll be sure to read that out. In the meantime, I think we have a question here at the front. Let me get a microphone to you.
Hi, that was really, really cool. Thank you for that. I think it was Nick at one point you mentioned this word or concept that I've never heard before, and I was wondering if you could talk more about it. Emotional vectors. What do you mean by that?
Oh, yeah. So when we study emotions, a vector has a direction, so negative and positive, and then, of course, a magnitude, how strong you're feeling it. In the sense of place literature, it was always positive. There was just a presumption that you only form sense of place with positive emotions. And in our research, we found every bit as much evidence that it can be negative too. There are the places I never want to go back to. And that somewhat conflicts with how we think about nostalgia, because nostalgia in the end, for the most part, is bittersweet but positive. And I don't know if we've reconciled that yet. My gut is that you're probably not nostalgic for those negative emotional vector places, but you're probably quite nostalgic for the positive emotional vectors. So it's a way to try to understand both the direction and the magnitude of the emotion. And it starts getting more complex when you get into some of the higher level emotions, including like conflicting emotions, like nostalgia. Yeah. Does that help? Cool, thanks.
Right over here in the front. Oh.
Yeah, for the folks on the couch, I noticed in both those presentations you mentioned Hyrule and Azeroth as well, but I'm going to focus on Hyrule. And I think one of the most interesting things about the Zelda franchise, which you mentioned off the top, is like they sort of recognize that players each have these lingering kind of emotions, but they're all connected to different Hyrules. And they have this desire to make all of them canon at the same time through a very fancy timeline. So I'm wondering if you can like just speak a little bit to this kind of corporate desire to almost like formalize and absorb this nostalgia and make it all canon and then resell it back to consumers.
I do have one answer. The fascinating part about the most recent two entries, which are the most sensory immersive, that have by far the deepest narratives and probably have all the triggers of this, they use the same map twice. That was pretty bold. Made it easy to play. Like, I know where that tree is. But it does, I never thought of it this way. It does override my prior experiences. Because now that map from when I was a kid that I wrote on a piece of paper in my living room because I threw the book out, right? That Hyrule doesn't exist really anymore. It's increasingly hard for it to exist. And the fact that now the games, and there are other games that have done this, Far Cry New Dawn recycled the map from Far Cry 5. Some of the Fallout games. I wonder, I never thought of it that way, but it could be speaking to when the place becomes consistent and dominant, it does sort of shape, well, what functions it can play, what your relations are in there. I never thought of it that way, but possibly. It's clever. It has a lot of good benefits, but it does literally, like overtly override any previous version of that land. And because it's so rich and vibrant and big, we probably don't think about it. Like, this one's prettier. This one I spent 500 hours in, so it must be the better one? I don't know.
If I could add one thing, I haven't played this, but one thing that's really interesting about reusing the same map is that maybe the way that I've been hearing this notion of nostalgia from the talks before is kind of like these roots, these tendrils from an object, like for example the bowl, to past experiences that a person might have had. And if you think about the map in that way, then the first playthrough is like a rich tangle of roots and webs. And then you, even though you're overwriting, maybe the quality of the experience and engaging it with the overwriting process in the new instance of playing this same map again is just somehow richer by virtue of having connections to all these little tangles and roots. But it would be cool to kind of actually measure that.
I think that is it. So if you have any more questions, they're still here. So go ahead and ask them during our lunch period, which is now. So you might already smell it. So we have an hour set aside for lunch. We'll reconvene back here for the research creation panel at, oh, never mind. Take that back. Just go and enjoy lunch. We'll see you soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much once again to our panelists for this conversation. We're going to go ahead, close up the live stream, but we'll keep the Zoom going, and we'll catch you back here at 1:45 for the next panel, as well as the Research Creation Showcase at 2:45, okay? So see you back here, 1:45 for any room or space for love. Have a good lunch break.